Chapter 11. The Daily Life of Mastermind.
Be careful today. I don't want you getting hurt on your way to school, Inko fretted.
Izuku rolled his eyes.
Mom, I'll be fine. Aldera High School is literally a 10-minute walk. I don't even have to take the train.
Inko brushed imaginary dust off of the shoulders of his blue uniform.
I know. It's just that there's so much more crime nowadays with Mastermind on the loose, and I just worry about you. You know that.
Izuku sighed internally. Yeah, he knew that Mom worried. He also knew she'd worry less if he'd been born with a quirk. He hid his frustration behind a smile.
I gotta go, Mom. I don't want to be late for the first day of high school.
She waved at him, with the famous Midoriya tears in her eyes, as he shouldered his backpack and walked down the road towards his new school. It had been pretty easy to get into. He'd applied a few other places, including a few that had a track that specialized in analysis and hero support. All of those had taken one look at the red "Quirkless" written on his ID and promptly let him know that he wasn't the right fit for their schools. In the end, it was better this way. Going to a prestigious school would bring attention, something that Izuku couldn't afford right now. The police hadn't tried to arrest him since he'd started his hostage situation, but he was almost certain that Nezu was working hard to try to uncover his identity. It was what Izuku would do. If they could find out who he was, then they might be able to find the computer program that he'd hired Labrava to write, so that it would release his murder plans if his arrest or death was ever trending on the internet. Or they'd go after Jiran, who also had instructions to release the plans if anything happened to him. But Izuku knew from experience that no one suspected anything from the quirkless kid, especially one that didn't even stand up to his own bullies. If Izuku Midoriya was ever a suspect for Mastermind, his lack of quirk would instantly clear him of any suspicion. If the police looked past that, then the fact that none of his bullies had died mysteriously in the last year would be brought as evidence that he obviously wasn't capable of being a villain. What the police wouldn't know is that Izuku Midoriya, quirkless Deku, was a mask. And if they managed to look past all that, well, then they were smarter than Izuku ever gave them credit for. And maybe, just maybe, they deserved to arrest him. Hey, Deku, haven't thrown yourself off a bridge yet? The bully, Makoto Ito, was big, stupid, and obviously trying to fill the void that Katsuki had left by going to UA, if the crowd of sycophants surrounding him were any indication. Izuku resisted the urge to glare at him.
Hi, Ito. How are you today?
It was amazing how quickly people saw weakness when Izuku stuttered. He smirked internally as Ito puffed out his chest and sneered at him. Don't try to be friends, Deku. You're worthless, and don't you forget it. With that, Ito shoved him to the ground and turned on his heel to enter the school, followed by his entourage. Izuku stood and brushed himself off. He'd gotten worse from Toga on their first day of training. He smiled at the thought of his friend. He'd have to remember all the dumb things his bullies said to tell her later. She'd get a kick out of it, and they'd giggle about all the ways they'd kill the idiots. It was a good friendship. By the time Izuku got to class, he was back to wearing the mask of weak, quirkless Deku, but underneath, he felt stronger than any of them. Izuku walked around the apartment and checked the security system one more time. From the outside, it looked just like any apartment in the red light district, but the walls were heavily fortified, and the security system could probably put UA to shame, and it was all his. Izuku sighed. He could finally stop smuggling his villain outfit out of the house and changing in Jiran's office. Nice digs, kid. Jiran leaned up against the doorway in the kitchen. Thanks for finding this place for me, Jiran. I feel like I finally made it, you know? Jiran chuckled. Sorry to have to tell you this, but you made it a while ago. I can count on one hand the number of villains that have the balls to threaten a top 50 hero on national television, not even to mention all of them at once. If you're not careful, they'll start calling you the #1 villain in Japan or some other bullshit. Well, it was always my dream to be like All Might. Why don't you just live here full time, kid? You don't have to keep living with your mother and doing the whole song and dance routine at school like you're not one of the most powerful villains in Japan right now. Izuku pulled the soda out of the fridge. Disappearing would call too much attention to me right now. Missing posters, the police looking for me in 2 identities. There would be too many chances for them to connect the two, and it would just be too much work when it's easier to avoid the whole problem. Plus, I'm not ready to leave Mom yet. Despite how much she worries, I still love her, and she's been the only one who ever cared about me until last year. I don't want to put her through that, and I'd miss her too much. Suit yourself. Jiran shrugged. You ready for your meeting tonight? Izuku nodded. Just need to get dressed and I'll be on my way. I've been going to these meetings for months, Jiran. You don't need to worry about me. Jiran held his hands up in surrender. All right. I get it. You've got your big boy britches on and everything. I'll just be on my way. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Izuku crossed his arms. Jiran, would you have threatened all top 50 heroes? Jiran chuckled. Good point, kid. Have fun. He waved and walked out the front door. Izuku went to the closet and pulled out his villain costume. Time to get back to work. Izuku walked into the Blue Dog's base with his head held high. The gang leader was already waiting for him. Mastermind. Pleasure to finally meet you. My name is Tanaka. Please, take a seat. Izuku sat in the chair offered. So, what can I do for you? Tanaka ran his hand through his hair and smiled condescendingly, and Izuku tensed slightly. Something seemed off, but Izuku didn't know if there was something legitimately wrong or if he was just among villains. We want to run the Okane Bank. We're looking for a big haul. Izuku nodded. Should be doable. What are your quirks? One of the other thugs snarled. What do you need to know our quirks for? Izuku rolled his eyes. Because normally it's advisable to use your quirks when robbing a bank. If you'd like a completely quirkless plan, I can do that, but most people don't go for that option, oddly enough. Once he had decided that the thug had been sufficiently cowed, he turned back to Tanaka, who was still giving him that same smile that set Izuku's teeth on edge. That's just Takahashi for you. He's got a gas manipulation quirk, allows him to control any gas, including the air in people's lungs. Tanaka jerked his thumb over the other thug standing in the corner of the room, can see in the dark, and he pointed towards a woman leaning against the wall, playing with a knife, can throw any knife with 100% accuracy. I have a strength enhancement quirk that can lift 3 times my own body weight. The heavier I am, the more I can lift. Izuku nodded. This matched up pretty well with the information he'd been able to gather before arriving. At least they weren't trying to lie to him, so why did it feel so off? Alright, all that's left is the matter of my fee. Tanaka's smile turned wicked, and he pulled out a gun and leveled it at Izuku's head. How's this for a fee, Pipsqueak? You give us a plan, and we'll let you walk out of here alive. Izuku looked around the room to find the other 2 men had their guns trained on him, and the woman had her knife-throwing quirk, and 2 knives in each hand. He sighed. This explains why he'd been feeling off the whole meeting. He really should start listening to his gut more often. As he scanned the room, Izuku weighed his options. He couldn't just fight his way out. He'd escaped pro-heroes before, but then again, the pro-heroes weren't trying to kill him. He eyed the woman with her knives. With her quirk, he'd be walking out of here with at least 1 stab wound. Not the end of the world, but something he'd prefer to avoid, if at all possible. Stabs were harder to hide than bruises and burns, after all, and he'd rather not make his mom more worried. On the other hand, he could just give them the plans, but he didn't want word going out that you could just threaten Mastermind rather than paying. It was bad for business. Izuku thought for another moment before deciding. It sounds like you have yourself a deal. Tanaka put away his gun and smiled. I knew you'd come around, Pipsqueak. Now, how about you give us those plans? As Izuku wrote, he smiled wickedly beneath his mask. Yes, he'd let them have their plans. but a fat lot of good the money would do them with what they had coming. Fun fact, everyone has enemies willing to pay to bring them down. Detective Tsukachi, there's been an interesting development in the Okane Bank case. Tsukachi gestured for the officer to continue. They're dead, sir. The detective did a double take. I'm sorry, what did you say? The perpetrators of the robbery, they're all dead. The officer said. One was found strangled in his home alongside his family. Another seems to die in a bar fight, although I doubt it's a coincidence. Another was found in a back alley, stabbed through the throat. The leader's body was left in front of a Channel 9 news station. He appeared to have been starved and tortured to death. All of the murders were done by different people at different times. The only thing linking them was that they were all members of the Blue Dogs gang that robbed Okane Bank last week. Tsukachi looked at the officer. And you think Mastermind is behind it? The officer shrugged. It was pretty obvious he's behind the robbery. But why would he eliminate paying customers? It seems like a bad business choice to me. I brought in a guy who has known dealings with the gang. You want to talk to him? Tsukachi nodded absently and grabbed his files on Mastermind and on the Okane Bank robbery. He walked into the interrogation room, set the files on the table, and sat down opposite to the twitchy young man waiting for him. All right, let's just get straight to the point. What can you tell me about the elimination of the Blue Dogs gang? The man rubbed his fingers together and looked around the room like he was expecting threats to pop out of the wall at any moment. It was their own fault. True. Tsukachi tilted his head. What do you mean by that? They screwed over the wrong person. Do you mean Mastermind? Tsukachi asked, and the man nodded. Tanaka wasn't ever the type to play fair. He would screw you over to get $1, and you'd do it every time. Word is that he tried that on Mastermind. Held a gun to his head to get the pants for free. He rushed out. He should have just paid. You don't mess with Mastermind. True. You think he killed him to send a message? To his surprise, the man shook his head. Mastermind didn't kill him. True. Tanaka had enemies, they all did, but it wasn't a coincidence that all their enemies suddenly knew their every weakness right after they pulled that shit. True. Tsukachi stood. Thank you. You've been a big help. As soon as the door to the interrogation room closed, he sighed and rubbed his eyes. It took a major idiot to try to screw over someone who had managed to kill a hero while he was in police protection. He put the files back on his desk and stood. Maybe he should call Toshinori and go to dinner. Get away from this case for an hour or two. He nodded and grabbed his coat before calling his friend. At least Mastermind didn't know about Yagi Toshinori. Tsukachi shuddered at what would happen if Mastermind figured out how weak All Might really was right now, but his friend had always been incredibly careful with his identity, so they had nothing to worry about. Right? Chapter 12. The League of Villains. Izuku scribbled in his notebook as he watched the news. A few new heroes had debuted, but that wasn't what caught his attention. What had caught his attention was a group of reporters trying to interrogate a few UA staff members about All Might. It had been a short clip, probably only about 20 seconds, but it was clear that the cameraman had been inside the gates. The reporters didn't call any attention to it, but Izuku knew that UA didn't give out press passes. So how did they get in? He was just considering hacking into traffic cameras around there to satisfy his curiosity when his phone rang. Jiran. Mom, I'll be in my room. Okay, sweetie, don't stay up all night. Izuku answered the call right as he closed his door. So, Jiran, what have you got for me? Anything interesting? On the other end of the line, Jiran chuckled. I'll let you be the judge of that. Have you ever heard of the League of Villains? Izuku frowned slightly. No, but they sound pretentious. He went to sit on the bed. They must not be a very big group if I haven't heard of them yet. How long have they been around? Not very long, Jiran said. From what I understand, there are only 2 or 3 real members, but they're backed by the boogeyman of the underground, so I wouldn't underestimate them. They're planning something big and going through a massive recruitment.
I'm fine on my own, thanks, Izuku drawled. Why would I tie myself down to an organization?
A chuckle came through the other end of the line. Calm down, kid. You just be a consultant. He paused. So, will you meet with them?
I don't know, Izuku responded. They haven't even done anything yet, or am I supposed to just rely on some boogeyman's reputation? Jiran paused for a long moment, and Izuku could almost see him taking a long drag of his cigarette like he always did when he was thinking.
Well, Shigaraki told me they broke into UA earlier today. I don't know, the news didn't cover a break-in.
A slow grin spread across Izuku's face. Because the media took advantage of them destroying the gate and most likely provided a perfect distraction for whatever the League wanted to do. The media didn't report it as a break-in because they'd be the ones blamed for it, so it got pretty much under the radar. That's brilliant.
So, can I tell Shigaraki to expect you tonight?
Izuku couldn't wipe the smile from his face. If they want me to plan something as bold as breaking into UA, definitely. Izuku was surprised when he arrived at the address that Jiran had texted him, only to find that it was a bar. He shrugged. I guess I get to check been to a bar off my bucket list, he thought. It was even more pleasantly surprising when he went inside to find it clean and tastefully decorated, a nice change from the derelict warehouses and docks he was used to meeting clients in. The bartender, made of mist, polished a glass behind the counter, and Izuku's eyes narrowed in on the metal braces he wore around his neck. Interesting. He must have a physical body that needs to be protected. A scraggly-looking young man, probably only a few years older than Izuku, was sitting at one of the bar stools, playing a handheld game console, although Izuku wondered how he saw the screen with a severed hand clutching his face. At least he wouldn't have to deal with these villains discounting his planning skills on account of his age if one of their people was a teenager too. Izuku sauntered up to the counter. Which one of you is Shigaraki? There was no answer for a long moment before the teenager paused his game and set it down on the counter.
Had to reach a safe point. I'm Shigaraki. Jiran said you'd be interested in joining our party.
Izuku tilted his head. That remains to be seen. I'm more of a solo player, to tell you the truth, but I understand teaming up to defeat big bosses. The hand on Shigaraki's face moved slightly, and Izuku guessed the man was smiling.
Kurogiri, I like this one. And yes, Mastermind, we're going to be taking down the biggest boss of them all Might.
Izuku's eyes widened. That's a pretty lofty quest for a relatively unknown party such as yourself. The look in Shigaraki's eyes was deranged.
But we can do it! Sensei, tell him about the Nomu!
Izuku turned back to the mist bartender, expecting an explanation, but he was met with only silence. Instead, a staticky voice came from the tiny TV set resting in the corner.
As you wish, Shigaraki. And may I simply say that it is a pleasure to see you here, Mastermind. I've heard many things about you.
Izuku eyed the TV suspiciously. All good, I hope. You must be the boogeyman of the underground that Jiran told me about if you won't even show your face at this meeting. A chuckle cut through the static.
I suppose some have called me that, but you may call me All for One.
Izuku nodded. The name sounded familiar, but he'd have to look it up later. So, what is this Nomu that Shigaraki mentioned?
The Nomu is a genetically engineered monster with multiple quirks, including strength, regeneration, and shock absorption. I created it to be on par with All Might's strength.
Izuku hummed and sat down. Interesting, but the problem with monsters is that they're hard to control. The Nomu are practically brain dead, Shigaraki said briefly, and super obedient. This one will only obey orders from me and will do exactly what I tell it to. And you believe it has the power to destroy All Might? Of course, Sensei made it.
Izuku frowned. Hero worship, even if it was for a villain, was dangerous. He made a mental note not to trust anything that Shigaraki said when it came down to All for One's abilities. In the event that he cannot kill All Might, Kurogiri spoke up for the first time, it will most definitely weaken him. I suppose that's true, Izuku said. So, what's the plan? Just throw the Nuumu at All Might when he's on patrol, or does it have something to do with the break-in at UA? Your intelligence stats are off the charts, Shigaraki said. We broke in to get a class schedule. In a few days, All Might will be teaching class in a building away from the rest of campus. That's where we'll kill him. Kurogiri will warp us right into the building when they least expect it. The muscle we've recruited will take care of the hero brats and other pros, and the Nomu will take care of All Might. Izuku nodded. His mind was buzzing. He'd never been obsessed with getting revenge on All Might for crushing his dreams. Society had done more to do that than the #1 pro, but he'd be lying if he said that the idea of revenge didn't appeal to him. But there were too many unknowns in this plan for him to be entirely comfortable with it. What happened if the Nomu failed? How could they make sure All Might was weak when he fought it? What happened if All Might used all his time in the morning and never showed up to class? He began to sort out his thoughts, letting his brain come up with plans for every eventuality. After a few minutes of this, Izuku realized that the others were staring at him, most likely waiting for his answer. All right, sounds like a plan. However, I'd like to make a few changes if that's all right with you. Shigaraki looked to Kurogiri, who nodded. Shigaraki gestured for Izuku to continue. First of all Might has weaknesses that we can take full advantage of, one of which is that he has a time limit for how long he can be active each day. This is good for us, but could also potentially bite us in the ass if he does too much work in the morning and doesn't show up to class. All for One said. What do you suggest? Well, Izuku pulled out his notebook. Both of us have significant pull in the underground. Between the two of us, I'm sure we can manipulate the city so that All Might has to interfere with about 2 hours worth of crimes, but no more than that. Last I heard, All Might's limit was around 3 hours, so if we keep him occupied for 2 of them, he'll be as weak as he can get while still ensuring that he shows up from class. From there, we'll need to split up the hero students and get them away from the entrance. It's important that none of them escape to get help from other heroes. We'll also need some way to jam communications so no one can call for help. That is already taken care of, Kurogiri said calmly. One of the villains we've recruited has an electric-type quirk, perfect for jamming signals. Izuku wrote down what they had so far. Do you know the students' quirks? It'll be better if we know what to look for. Shigaraki shook his head. They're just brats. They can't do much damage. Izuku wasn't so sure. If all the students were as strong as Katsuki, then they could do a lot of damage indeed. He looked at Shigaraki coldly. People would probably say the same about you and me. Age is not a measure of competence. He bit his pencil. Unfortunately, the staff is already probably on guard after today's break-in, and hacking into the records now would tip our hand. It's not ideal, but we'll just have to split them up as soon as we arrive. The four spent the next few hours debating different plans and making sure everything would go smoothly. By the time Izuku went back home, he was almost too excited to sleep. He looked at his bare walls and the still visible outlines where the posters had been, and smiled brightly. Watch out, All Might. Mastermind is coming. Chapter 13. USJ. Bakugo tried to keep himself on the bus ride, but that stupid shitty hair extra just would not leave him alone. He and his equally loud and upbeat friends surrounded Bakugo, who was seriously 2 seconds from exploding. Not that Bakugo himself wasn't loud. He knew he was, but he was an angry type of loud, not whatever these extras were. They weren't anything like the extras that had followed him around in middle school. Those ones only ever spoke up if it was to agree with him or to praise his quirk. Where these guys talked about everything under the sun and just wouldn't shut up. They even had the balls to laugh at him and call his personality a garbage heap. Seriously? All Might and Aizawa-sensei sat in front of the bus, ignoring the class's antics. Aizawa looked almost as annoyed as Bakugo was, probably because All Might wouldn't shut up either. Or maybe that's just what Aizawa always looked like? It was hard to tell. He followed the teachers into the facility and rolled his eyes when the stupid space heroes started their spiel. Sounds like they really wanted the acronym of this place to be the same as Universal Studios Japan. And yeah, he knew Quarks would kill. That's why he wanted his name to be King Explosion Murder. Ugh, just let him blow some stuff up already. All of a sudden, a purple dot appeared in the courtyard, and 13's voice trailed off as the students started muttering. Is this part of the training? No, Aizawa said as people started pouring out of the strange purple mist. Those are villains. The students fell silent as they watched the crowd grow larger. A guy with a hand on his face seemed to be the leader, but he wasn't the one the students' eyes were drawn to. The students took in a collective breath as they saw a short figure in a green hooded jacket, bright eyes visible as they scanned the students. I thought Mastermind never participated in his crimes, Yaoyorozu said faintly. What's different this time? Aizawa was already running down to meet the villains, trying to keep Mastermind and the hand villain in his sights. Unfortunately, that means he didn't notice when the mist villain left his field of vision. Hello, students. The mist villain stood in front of the door. We would normally take our time to introduce ourselves, but Mastermind assures us that time is of the essence. Bakugo ran forward and saw Shitty Hair doing the same, but before they could reach the guy, the ground beneath their feet had disappeared, and they were somewhere else entirely, surrounded by villains on every side. Bakugo grinned. Finally, a good excuse to go all out. Izuku grinned as all the students were spread throughout the facility. Perfect. All Might would need to track them down before he would be able to help any of them escape, but he'd have to get past the Nomu first. He stalked towards them, flexing his muscles and looking intimidating as his smile turned to a grimace. You fiends! What have you done with them? Don't worry, All Might, Shigaraki cackled. We're not here for them. We're here for you. Nomu, get him! The Nomu surged forward, and All Might leveled a punch at his gut. Izuku took a sick sort of satisfaction, and the look of shock that he saw on All Might's face before the Nomu returned his punch, and he went flying across the courtyard. Ah! Both pros looked towards the front entrance as a cry rang out from the entrance, and 13 crumpled under the force of their own quirk. There wasn't time for them to dwell on it, however, because the Nomu charged, and the horde of villains swarmed Eraserhead. Izuku stood back and watched as the pros fought. It was really quite impressive. He heard panicked screaming and glanced over to the shipwreck zone to see a girl jumping ashore with 2 purple-haired boys in her arms, one of which was the source of the screams. How heroic. Many of the villains were sitting dazed in the water, apparently in a sort of trance, most likely the other purple-haired boy's quirk. It couldn't be the girl's, considering she was moving like a frog. He'd have to be careful of that boy. Kurogiri had rejoined the fight in the main plaza as All Might suplexed Nomu, opening a portal and allowing Nomu to grab All Might from below. All Might grimaced as the Nomu's claws dug into the old wound at his side and started pulling All Might through the portal, but was interrupted when a massive wave of ice froze him in place, allowing for the hero to escape. Izuku whipped around to look at the source, finding a boy with red and white hair glaring at him. He pulled out a pair of combat knives and ran towards the student, only to be blocked by Eraserhead, who had finally dispatched the crowd of villains that he'd faced. Izuku dodged the capture weapon and slashed at the pro, who jumped back just in time. Eraserhead had his quirk focused on Mastermind, but it didn't slow him down at all. The two were evenly matched when it came to combat. Eraser had more experience, but Mastermind had knives, and he wasn't afraid to kill. Die! Izuku flinched as Bakugo yelled, but his old bully and another red-haired student headed straight for Kurogiri instead. Izuku turned back to Eraserhead. Kurogiri could fight for himself. Bakugo let loose an explosion as the two neared the mist villain, but instead of hitting him as they obviously planned, their attacks went straight through him.
That was close. You students are too problematic.
And with that, he warped all 3 students away again. Even if the students had managed to defeat all the villains in the areas they were warped to, it would still take them time to get back to the plaza. A tearing sound echoed as the Nomu tore himself from the ice and regenerated his lost limbs.
Did you think that shock absorption was the Nomu's only quirk?
Shigaraki's grating voice taunted as his smile turned deranged underneath his hand mask.
He was designed to withstand you at 100% of your power, All Might.
All Might clutched at his side and stood tall, spitting out a mouthful of blood.
Shock absorption, huh? Not nullification?
All Might rushed towards the Nomu and let loose a flurry of blows that the Nomu returned with vigor.
That means there's a limit to what you can take. You've already told me how to beat him. If he's designed to withstand 100% of my power, then I will just have to go beyond that.
Izuku smirked, but Eraser tried to take advantage of his distraction and attack despite the high winds from the fight.
Not so fast, Eraserhead.
Shigaraki ran up behind the pro and grabbed his elbow right before he had to blink. Eraserhead's elbow began to disintegrate as he cried out in pain. Izuku ran forward, and Eraserhead reared his head back as a blade narrowly missed his eyes, leaving a long, jagged cut along his right cheekbone. Shigaraki threw him towards the floor, and Izuku kicked him in the head, knocking him unconscious.
Plus! Ultra!
All Might cried, and the Nomu went flying through the ceiling of the USJ. All Might turned to face Shigaraki. Most of the students had already escaped the zones and were gathered around the edge of the plaza, cheering for their hero's victory. Izuku used the dust cover to slowly sneak around as All Might began monologuing.
You've been bested, villains. Surrender.
Izuku smiled as he noticed the steam mixed in with the dust. All Might was nearing his limit, if he wasn't past it already. Izuku adjusted his grip on the knife in his hand as he snuck up behind the hero. All Might remained focused on convincing Shigaraki of his bluff.
What's wrong? Not attacking me? Didn't you want to clear this level? Come on and get me if you dare.
Shigaraki smiled.
Oh, I fully plan on clearing it, but you don't face the big boss alone.
Izuku took that as his cue. He grinned as he stabbed All Might right in his old injury. A puff of steam erupted, and All Might coughed up blood as the smoke cleared to reveal the skeletal form of Toshinori Yagi. All Might! Some of the students cried out, and others just wordlessly screamed.
What's wrong, All Might?
Shigaraki said gleefully.
I thought we'd been bested.
Izuku pulled out his knife, only to stab the hero again and twist the knife. All Might was choking out his own blood now, and Izuku pulled the hero's head back by the hair. So much for the symbol of peace, Izuku whispered in his ear. I guess even people with strong quirks like you can't be heroes. All Might struggled weakly for a moment before slowly going limp as he lost too much blood. Izuku put away his knife and tossed the hero's lifeless form to the ground before checking his pulse. He smirked as he stood and stepped over the body. Congratulations, Shigaraki. You did it. The students cried and screamed, unable to move as Shigaraki laughed. Suddenly, a voice raised over the rest of the students. You bastard! Who do you think you are? Shigaraki was about to reply when Izuku held up a hand to make him stop. He turned to the tall, purple-haired student who was staring at him defiantly. What? Not gonna say anything? Izuku scanned the face of the other students, seeing traces of hope among the terror and grief. He thought back to the dazed villain from the shipwreck zone, and turned back to the student who obviously wanted him to respond. He simply smiled at the student and turned to Shigaraki. Come on, Shigaraki. Let's gather your forces and go home. We've done what we came here to do. Kurogiri spread out his mists to retrieve the villains as Shigaraki got the last word.
Remember the League of Villains, heroes. You'll be facing us again soon enough.
He and Izuku disappeared through the warp gate, leaving the students alone. The doors to the USJ opened slowly, and Nezu walked in with several other teachers.
Is everything all right? We heard an explosion and... Oh my.
The teachers took in the tear-marked faces of the student 13 lying near the door with a lacerated back, Eraserhead by the fountain bleeding heavily from his head wound, and finally, All Might's skeletal form lying in a pool of his own blood. They were too late. Chapter 14. Aftermath. Thousands showed up for the funeral of the symbol of peace. Tsukachi stood stoically next to Sir Night-Eye as Gran Torino took the podium to give the eulogy. I've known All Might since before he was the symbol of peace. Back then, he was just a kid with a dream. We thought he was crazy, thinking that he could decrease crime just by being visible, by being a symbol. But I guess he was just crazy enough to pull it off. All Might dedicated his life to protecting people, and now he's dedicated his death, too. The villains were after him, make no mistake, but All Might did his darndest to make sure that none of those kids were hurt. And he succeeded. That is his legacy. That wherever All Might was, people were safe. He made the world safer just by being there, by being himself. He will be missed, that's for sure, and the world won't be the same without him, but if I know anything about All Might, I know that he wouldn't want us to lose hope. He'd want us to keep going, keep fighting, keep protecting those in need. Thank you, All Might, and goodbye. Gran Torino went to stand back by Tsukachi, wiping his eyes surreptitiously. The three walked over to the casket along with several other heroes, taking up their spaces as the pallbearers. They had managed to keep up the existence of All Might's skeletal form out of the media, so the casket was much larger than it probably needed to be. Tsukachi had caught a glimpse before they'd closed it. Toshinori had looked so small, dwarfed by his own casket, by his own legacy. He thought that the people were supposed to look peaceful in death, but all Tsukachi could think of was the agony and despair that his friend had felt in his final moments, as Mastermind slid a dagger between his ribs. Mastermind, who Tsukachi was supposed to have caught. If he had just been a little faster on the first raid, or realized that the villain existed sooner, or managed to track him down before he started showing his face, then maybe, just maybe, his friend would still be alive, still be beside him, laughing until he coughed up blood, rather than lying in a box that was really too big for him. They lowered him into the ground, and Tsukachi couldn't take it anymore. He tried not to run, but walked quickly away from the graveside, not stopping until he reached the relative privacy of the bathroom. He burst into tears, and he didn't even try to hold them back as he thought of his friend. Not All Might, not the symbol of peace, but his friend, murdered in cold blood because he couldn't do his job as a fucking cop and catch the guy. He buried his head in his hands and collapsed onto the dirty cement floor, not even caring that he'd have to dry clean his suit after this. He'd been sobbing for a few minutes when he felt arms around him and looked up. He could barely see Gran Torino through the tears, but the old pro was kneeling beside him, whispering to him to breathe and that everything was going to be all right. It's not your fault, Tsukachi. There wasn't anything you could have done to prevent it. I could have, Tsukachi sobbed. I could have caught him. I could have ignored the stupid hostage situation and put the bastard in Tartarus so he couldn't have hurt anyone else. I could have... Stop that! Gran Torino hit him on the head with his cane. If you'd ignored the hostage situation, there'd be a lot more dead people, and there's still a chance that Toshinori still could be dead. Mastermind knew his weakness. He knew about his injury. He knew about his time limit. No matter what anyone did, Mastermind was always going to kill Toshinori eventually. And the guilt for that rests solely on the bastard that held the knife. Not on me, or on you, or on anyone else. Do you hear me? But, no. Gran Torino's right. The two looked up to see that Sir Night-Eye had joined him. If we were to assign blame on your criteria, I would be just as guilty as you. I was the one who told him to go to UA and find a successor. If I hadn't pushed him like that, he never would have been there, and those villains never would have come. But if we lose ourselves in blame, we will be paralyzed with doubt and fear, and then we will never be able to catch the man who killed our friend. And I won't let that happen." The other two looked up at him in shock, surprised by the ferocity of his declaration. Sir Night-Eye had tears streaming silently down his face now, and his hands were clenched at his sides. Suddenly, Gran Torino reached forward and pulled Night-Eye down on the floor, wrapping his arms around him. "It'll be all right, even if he's not here. It has to be all right." The three didn't know how long they stayed there, sobbing on the floor and holding on to each other for dear life, but by the time they left, the crowds had already dispersed. The news crews were gone, and the gravediggers were already filling the hole with dirt. They each went their separate ways, and Gran Torino waved to the others as they left before turning to face the grave one last time. "We'll catch the guy that did this, Toshinori," he whispered. "We have to." "So, I need to be completely honest with you." Nezu sat solemnly at the head of the table. The staff of UA had gathered for a meeting on how to move forward after All Might's death. 13 was wrapped in bandages, and Aizawa still had a thick piece of gauze taped under his eye, both physical reminders of what had happened. At least the media wasn't blaming them for All Might's death. If anything, they were being praised for how well they protected the students against a horde of unbeatable villains. "The League of Villains only came to UA because All Might was here," Nezu continued. "That was the ultimate goal, and his presence put the student in danger. And for that, I am truly sorry."
Why did you think it was a good idea for him to teach here anyways? He didn't even have teaching credentials, and
Aizawa huffed angrily.
those villains put our students through hell. They had to learn too early that not every villain could be Pete. They had to watch the symbol of peace die. It's not something we can erase from their minds. It's something that will stay with them forever. And it only happened because All Might was here.
At the time, I believed that the students could learn something from him. He was also unwilling to step down as a symbol of peace, so a teaching job gave him the excuse to step out of the spotlight for a time and respect his time limit. But the main reason I invited him to teach at UA was because of his quirk. Nezu looked around the table at the confused faces of his staff, and took a deep breath before continuing. All Might's quirk was unique in many senses of the word. It was called One for All, and it had an aspect that allowed it to be physically transferred to another person. Nezu ignored the shocked looks and whispers. He came to UA to find a suitable successor for his quirk. I thought I could point him to some of our students that have been doing well, and he could groom them to become the next symbol of peace. "So," Midnight spoke up, "are you telling us that one of our students has All Might's quirk now?" Nezu looked up at her. "No, that's just the thing. He had spent the year so far looking at several students, but he had not yet made the decision at the time of his death. Normally, I wouldn't have dreamed of telling you this secret, but it doesn't matter anymore. All Might was not able to pass on his quirk when he died."
"So why are you telling us?"
Aizawa asked.
"If you didn't pass it on, then it's a moot point, and we don't need to know."
Nezu sighed. "I wish it were that simple. You see, One for All has a brother quirk of sorts called All for One. The villain with this quirk can steal the quirks of others, which he has used to give himself a supernaturally long lifespan. We believe that he died in a confrontation with All Might several years ago, but his body was never recovered, and there is a possibility, however slight, that he survived. Until now, the only people strong enough to keep All for One in check have been the holders of One for All." There was a pause as everyone digested Nezu's words and their implications, and when it finally sunk in, the teacher stared at the principal in horror. "Now that All for One is gone," Nezu whispered, "I do not know if there is anyone alive strong enough to defeat All for One." "Will he come after the students?"
Mike asked quickly. I don't know, Nezu replied. With All Might gone, he shouldn't have any reason to, but there is always a possibility that he does not know that All Might never passed on his quirk and will look for the successor among their student body.
How will we protect the students?
Snipe asked. Nezu stared off into the distance. I don't know, he said softly. I don't know. Chapter 15. Shoto.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sports Festival. Can I get a plus ultra?
President Mike's booming voice could be heard even from the sidewalk outside the stadium, and Izuku shook his head. Heroes. Honestly, Izuku didn't know why they were still holding the festival this year after All Might had been killed on school grounds, but the principal had held a press conference a few days before the funeral, announcing that it would continue as planned. Something about how, with the symbol of peace gone, it fell to the rising generation to bring hope to the world, or something like that. Well, at least Izuku could get some good intel on the quirks he'd be facing in a few years. He wished that he'd had the info before the USJ attack, but oh well. Better late than never, he supposed. He walked past dozens of pro heroes as he went through the heightened security, but no one gave the kid in a t-shirt and jeans a second glance. He smiled and found his seats. Mastermind was here in their midst, and the heroes would never know. His mom had been so excited when he told her that a friend of his had won tickets and invited him to go. They'd never had the money to afford it before, but Izuku hadn't had a shortage of cash since he'd become a villain. Too bad his mom didn't know about his secret funds, hence the cover story. He wished he could have brought Himiko, but a suspected serial killer couldn't exactly sneak past security.
All right, let's welcome in the students who faced a villain attack and survived. The same students All Might gave his life for. Class 1A!
The stadium erupted into cheers, and Izuku watched as the familiar students stride into the stadium. They looked vaguely uncomfortable. They probably didn't like the reminder of watching the number one hero die. It must have been dramatic. Izuku squashed the feelings of guilt that tried to choke him. They were heroes. They had been given everything in life just because of their quirks, while Izuku's life had been nothing but trauma. They deserved a little trauma after what they had put him through. Watching All Might die in front of them was just payback. He was excited to see what the purple-haired student's quirk actually was. He figured it was verbal response triggered, considering his defiant behavior at the USJ, but the question remained of whether it put someone to sleep like Midnight's quirk, or was somehow more involved. He was also excited for the half-and-half boy's quirk, since he was the one who managed to fight back during the attack. And against the Nomu, too. Izuku smiled darkly as he watched Katsuki climb the steps to give the opening speech. There was always the possibility that Katsuki would be injured during one of his matches, but Izuku knew he shouldn't get his hopes up.
I just want to say, All Might was an amazing hero. We owe it to him to give him our all, and that is why I'm going to win this thing.
Izuku rolled his eyes as the other students booed. Of course, Katsuki would manage to compliment All Might and insult his competitors all in one breath. His old bully would never change, would he? The first round was interesting, but not surprising. It was a surprise to learn that the half-and-half boy was Todoroki Shoto, the son of Endeavor. He had managed to freeze most of the competition and narrowly beat out Katsuki as the winner of the round. Izuku leaned forward as he watched Todoroki glare blankly at the crowd as Katsuki lost it. His coloring was very distinct, and he only created ice from his right side, so could he do it from his left? Izuku pulled out a notebook and began to write down his thoughts. It wouldn't surprise him at all if Todoroki had some kind of hybrid quirk. Unfair, but not unheard of. Maybe he could create ice from the right side of his body, the white-haired side, and fire from his left? If that was the case, why hadn't he shown off his fire side yet? It would have made much more sense to melt through the robots or use fire to propel himself like Katsuki did. But Todoroki only used his ice. Interesting. The next round gave Izuku a good chance to evaluate the purple-haired boy's quirk. He was named Shinso, at least according to the scoreboard. Izuku watched as he took advantage of the other teams as they targeted Todoroki. He would approach them as if he wanted to team up, and then the other team would simply hand over their points without a fight. So, some sort of brainwashing, not just putting them into a daze. Izuku wondered how complicated the commands could be. It was a useful quirk. Shame it had to go to a hero. In the end, Todoroki, Katsuki, and Shinso all moved on, as well as another team comprised mostly of Class 1A members, plus a support student, and Todoroki still didn't use his fire. Izuku knew he had it now. He'd seen it briefly ignite once while Katsuki had gotten too close, but Todoroki had looked angry and extinguished it almost immediately. His mastery of his ice was amazing, but Izuku couldn't help but wonder how powerful he could be if he stopped ignoring his left side. He put away his notebook, stretched, and headed for the student areas. He never had been very good at ignoring his curiosity, had he? Sneaking past the guards was almost too easy, even if they were pro heroes, and Izuku walked confidently as he searched for Todoroki. If he was caught, he could just say he was looking for Ka-chan, and that they were old friends. Sneaking backstage and wishing him luck was something the old Izuku would have done, no question.
You're a disgrace, Shoto.
Izuku ducked behind the wall as he heard Endeavor's voice.
There wouldn't even be a question of your position if you would just use the fire I gave you.
I will never use your fire. Todoroki's voice was tight in anger. I will make it to the top, but I will do it without your quirk.
Seriously, Shoto. I indulged you when you were younger, but it is time that you give up this childish tantrum.
Even from his place around the corner, Izuku could see his breath as the temperature dropped. It's time for you to go, father. The tournament will be starting soon. Izuku flattened himself against the wall as Endeavor stalked past him, radiating heat. The hero didn't even glance his way, just disappeared down the hall. Izuku waited a moment before turning the corner. It might not be the best timing, but he did not want to lose his chance to talk to Todoroki. Shoto's eyes widened slightly as a boy with green hair, obviously a civilian, came into view. This area was supposed to be off limits for spectators. Endeavor had gotten past security by virtue of being the new #1 hero, but this was just a normal kid, so how did he get back here? Was he a threat? Shoto relaxed slightly when the kid gave him a brilliant smile. Anyone who could smile like that couldn't be dangerous. Hello, Todoroki? The boy asked nervously, and Shoto nodded and the boy smiled. You're doing really well so far. Your skills are amazing. I especially loved how you beat out Katsuki in the last few rounds. Shoto raised one eyebrow. Katsuki? The boy's expression soured slightly. Interesting. Katsuki Bakugo. We've known each other since we were kids. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Izuku Midoriya. Shoto nodded. Why are you back here? Midoriya rubbed at the back of his neck. I actually have a question for you. You're obviously pretty powerful with just your ice, but you have a fire quirk as well, right? Why don't you use it? Shoto scowled and turned away. My father put you up to this, didn't he? Midoriya grabbed his arm. He was stronger than he looked. No, I was just curious, and I wanted to know because I thought it was interesting, not because I'm going to try to force you to use your fire. And I was just wondering, and... He trailed off and stood there awkwardly. Shoto didn't know if it was just one thing, but for some reason, he felt like he could trust Midoriya. Maybe it was his face when he talked about Bakugo, but for some reason, Shoto thought that if anyone could understand what he was going through, it was this boy he'd barely met. He sighed and leaned against the wall. Have you ever heard of quirk marriages? Midoriya's eyes widened in realization.
No. Shoto nodded sadly. My father always wanted to be the #1 hero. I guess he is now, but he wanted it to be because of his power, not because All Might got himself killed. He had enough money and enough power as the #2 hero to buy off my mother's family and force her into marriage. He got her pregnant multiple times while trying to create a child with a strong enough quirk to beat All Might. He raised me to be his masterpiece, not his son. Midoriya was listening with wide eyes, and Shoto took a deep breath. It felt liberating to finally talk about this. In every memory I have of my mother, she's always crying. She called my left side unbearable right before she poured boiling water on my face. I never blamed her, though. It was all my father's fault for forcing her to that point. Midoriya was staring at him strangely. You must hate your father, then. Shoto thought for a moment. Midoriya had said it like it was a statement rather than a question, but he wanted to answer it anyway. Did he hate his father? He thought about the rage he buried under a layer of ice, about the fear he felt when he thought about using his fire. Is that what hate felt like? Yes, he said firmly. I think I really do hate him. Midoriya nodded. I think that's good then. I understand why you don't want to use your fire, but just so you know, it's your quirk, not his, and you can always use it to do things your father would hate. Good luck, Todoroki. Crush Katsuki for me. And with that, Midoriya waved and left Todoroki to make his way back to his classmates.
Where did you go, you half-and-half bastard? Bakugo yelled. I looked everywhere for you and I couldn't find you.
Shoto felt consumed by the hatred he had just realized he felt, and it left him numb as he thought about Midoriya's words. I ran into an old friend of yours.
Friend? Ashido laughed. Bakugo had friends before you, eh?
Shut up, Pinky,
Bakugo yelled. Who was it?
Izuku Midoriya. He's interesting.
Bakugo sneered. Deku? He's worthless, and he is not my friend. I'd never sink low enough to be that idiot's friend.
Shoto nodded absently. I liked him. He then tuned out any response Bakugo had, and the laughter of the other classmates. He had a lot to think about. Chapter 16. The Hero Killer Stain.
Mastermind.
Izuku looked around and saw a pair of red eyes staring at him from the darkness. Well, I should hope I'm recognizable by now, he said cockily. I am pretty high profile.
You're the one who killed All Might.
Izuku smiled behind his mask and threw his arms out to his sides. With pride. What can I do for you?
You can die!
All of a sudden, 3 knives shot at him from the darkness. He managed to dodge the first 2, but the third grazed his cheekbone before clattering to the ground. His brain kicked into overdrive as he turned to look at his attacker. His eyes widened when he saw Stain, the hero killer. He knew that Stain had been known to kill villains, but that was back in his vigilante days. Now he mostly targeted heroes, well, except for him, apparently. Izuku quickly picked up the knife that had dropped and wiped the blood off the best he could. He didn't know how the hero killer's quirk worked exactly, just said it involved blood and paralysis, but the odds were that it was some sort of blood ingestion requirement for activation, like most blood-related quirks. He pulled his mask up a little higher to cover the cut on his cheek. So, are you going to tell me what I did to get on your hit list? Izuku asked. Stain was known to be long-winded, so hopefully he'd monologue long enough for Izuku to figure out how to either kill Stain or run away.
You killed All Might!
All of a sudden, Stain was right next to him, grazing his arm and licking the blade before Izuku could stop him. Izuku fell to the floor as his body gave out on him, and he tried to calm his breathing. Stain's quirk had a time limit. Izuku knew that much. He swallowed and hoped his intel was correct about how much Stain liked monologuing. You kill heroes too. We're not so different, you and I.
All Might was the one true hero among the scum. He was the only one worthy of the title hero. The heroes I killed were selfish beings pretending to do what was good for society, when in reality they were only furthering their own ends. They needed to be weeded out for the good of society. The heroes I killed sent a message to the one that remain that they need to improve or else fall victim to my blade.
And you believe All Might's death sends the wrong message? Izuku tried to move his fingers to no avail.
It sends the opposite message. Killing All Might was an act of senseless violence, and for that you must die. By killing All Might, you have not made Hero Society better. You have deprived of its crown jewel. There is nothing left worth keeping. All that's left is trash. Don't you understand what you have done?
Izuku's panic was starting to bubble up beneath his calm facade. This was it. This was how he died. He kept trying to move his fingers, but it felt like he wasn't even trying. He closed his eyes, preparing for the end, and then his finger twitched. Izuku resisted the urge to laugh hysterically. It felt like he was moving through taffy, but he could move.
It is scum like you who make it necessary for me to stain my hands with the blood of the unworthy. You are what is wrong with society.
Izuku looked up at Stain, but didn't move. It seemed he couldn't feel when his quirk ran off. Izuku could use that to his advantage. Stain moved around as he spoke, and at one point looked up at the sky.
I have judged you, and found you unworthy of life.
Izuku quietly stood and made his way behind the nearby dumpster. He held his breath as Stain looked back to where he should be.
Shit! He must be Type O!
He looked in either direction before gathering up his knives.
No matter. He can't have gone far. My blade will still taste his blood tonight.
And with that, Stain hurried out of the alley in search of his prey. Izuku waited for several long minutes before breathing a sigh of relief and coming out of his hiding place. He quickly took off his jacket and mask, hiding the knives inside like he had when he escaped in the hero raid. It was far too dangerous for Mastermind to be on the streets tonight. Izuku made his way back to base, and he thought through the fight. Stain would find him again soon enough, and when he did, only one of them would make it out alive.
No.
Come on, Stain, be reasonable. We both want to destroy the things we hate.
No.
Stain pulled out another knife.
You want to destroy the things you hate. I want to change society for the better. You have no vision, as evidenced by you killing the one and only true hero in this godforsaken society.
Please, Stain, Kurogiri said. We can change society together. Stain shook his head.
I will let you live, because I truly think you are trying to change society, but if I ever run into Mastermind again, he will taste my blade. Killing All Might will lead to all the wrong changes, and it is unforgivable.
He sheathed his blades.
Take me back to Hosu, Warp Gate. I still have business there.
Shoto Todoroki watched Ida brush off Uraraka as she tried to talk to him. He'd originally thought it was strange that Ida was going to intern in Hosu, because that's where his brother was attacked, but then he'd seen Ida's eyes. His eyes were full of the same hatred that Shoto felt swirling around inside him. Ever since Midoriya had made him aware of it, he just hadn't been able to ignore the feeling. He felt it constantly, to where sometimes it was all he could think about. After years of feeling numb, the anger felt nice. Shoto knew he should probably talk to someone about this, a therapist or something, but Endeavor was the #1 hero now. Who would ever believe that he had spent years abusing his wife and children just because of some one-sided rivalry with All Might. Shoto couldn't talk to anyone. He couldn't fight Endeavor and win. So, if Ida had something he could do to get rid of the festering anger inside of him, who was Shoto to get in the way? He silently watched Ida luck as he watched him leave. Hopefully he would find what he was looking for. Shigaraki scratched his neck as he overlooked Hosu at sunset.
That stupid hero killer, who does he think he is? I'll show him the change we're capable of.
Are you sure that you wouldn't prefer to consult with Mastermind before we enact our plan? Kurogiri asked. He has helped us in the past.
You don't need a strategist if all you're doing is causing chaos, Kurogiri, Shigaraki replied. Warp in the Nomu.
As Kurogiri complied, Shigaraki smiled and looked out at the still peaceful city.
I'll show them all. By this time tomorrow, everyone will have forgotten about Stain's pathetic changes.
Izuku cracked his neck as he left the meeting. Hosu was quite the journey from his home base, so he tried to make any prospective clients come to him if they wanted a face-to-face meeting. But this gang had the potential to be a big client, and Izuku decided to invest a little effort into making sure they had a good relationship. And this way, he'd be able to take care of his little Stain problem. Now, all Izuku needed to do was wander for a bit and see if he couldn't find the hero killer. All of a sudden, he was blown slightly off course by an explosion, and he panicked. What was Katsuki doing here? He was supposed to be interning with Bestrinus in another city. Izuku looked around quickly and sighed when he saw a group of heroes fighting in Nomu. It was just the League. He idly wondered what Shigaraki was trying to accomplish by letting them loose in Hosu of all places, and then decided it didn't matter. What the League chose to do with their resources was their own decision, Mastermind only needed to worry about it if they paid him. In fact, the League's interference only made things easier. Izuku thought, as he headed away from the distraction, Stain would be somewhere quiet, apart from the chaos, most likely in an alley. None of the heroes noticed Mastermind as he quietly began his search for the hero killer. Chapter 17. Mastermind vs. Stain. Ida shielded his head as a katana came out of nowhere, blocking his kick, removing off his helmet, and knocking him to the ground.
This is no place for a child.
Ida stood and let Stain see the rage in his eyes. Blood-red scarf, knives all over your body, you're Stain, the hero killer. I've been looking for you, but I didn't think I'd find you so soon. Stain leveled his katana at Ida's face.
Your eyes are searing with vengeance. Be careful what you say next, for even someone your age could be my target.
Ida clenched his fists in rage, and hatred clenched his heart. Are you saying I am not even a threat to you? He met Stain's eyes. My brother is a hero you attacked. He was the best older brother anyone could ever ask for. I have come to stop you, because he can't anymore. I'm going to make sure you remember my name as long as you live. I am Ingenium, and I will defeat you.
So be it,
Stain said.
Die.
Ida leveled a kick at the hero killer, who dodged and returned with a kick of his own, knocking Ida to the ground. Before he could even think to move again, Stain's katana was buried in his arm.
So you're Ingenium's brother. You don't deserve to call yourself heroes, you're fakes, both of you.
Ida grit his teeth. My brother was someone people looked up to. Now he'll never work as a pro hero again. You had no right to take that from him. I won't forgive you. I'll kill you!
Shouldn't you be worried about saving that guy?
Stain pointed his finger, and Ida followed to see where a pro hero named Native slumped against the wall of the alley. Ida's stomach sank. He hadn't even realized Native was there.
So busy with your grudge, you forgot all about him, right? You planned on using your quirk only for your own selfish desire and revenge. You're about as far from a hero as I can imagine.
Stain slid his katana from Ida's shoulder and licked it.
And that's why you will die tonight.
Ida couldn't move. He couldn't think. What would his parents think? What would Tensei think? They'd all be so disappointed, and he wouldn't even be able to apologize. Hot tears fell on the concrete. How could he have been so stupid?
Goodbye, child. May your death bring about a better world.
Ida closed his eyes and waited for the sharp bite of the katana. But it didn't come. Hello again, hero killer. Fancy seeing you here.
Mastermind.
Stain pointed his katana at the newcomer. Ida tried to look, but could just barely see dark red boots standing behind Stain.
So nice of you to come. My blade hungers for the blood of the bastard that killed All Might.
Did you know that the girl who taught me to fight loves you? Mastermind asked idly. When I told her I was killing you tonight, she was so excited. Told me to bring her a vial of your blood. Mastermind fixed Stain with a green-eyed stare. I don't intend to break my promise. Ida didn't think that was how love worked at all, but he figured that whoever taught Mastermind to fight must be as crazy as he was, so it was best not to question it. He tried to move his fingers, but he couldn't. Was this how Tensei had felt when he woke up and couldn't move his legs? Mastermind launched himself at Stain, a long knife in each hand. Stain sliced down with his katana, intending to lodge it in his opponent's shoulder, but Mastermind twisted out of the way at the last second, slashing Stain across the ribs. Stain hissed as the blade snuck between the metal plating on his suit and left a long gash.
You have excellent aim, Mastermind, he smiled. Unfortunately, I've been at this much longer than you have.
He ran forward again with his katana. This time, when Mastermind dodged, he kneed him in the stomach and then used the knife he had hidden in his other hand to slash at Mastermind's arm. He brought the blade to his mouth, only to look at the clean metal with confusion. A word of advice, Mastermind laughed. When planning to fight a blood quirk user, invest in excellent armor. Before Ida could blink, Mastermind was pushing Stain back, and he had to bite back a groan as Stain stepped on him before launching forward again. The two had seemingly forgotten about him in their haste to kill each other, and Ida didn't think it would be wise to remind them that he was still there, frozen on the ground. This time, Mastermind blocked the katana with his knives and twisted, disarming Stain and sending the sword skittering further down the alley. Stain didn't even look towards his fallen blade, instead pulling a pair of hunting knives from his belt and running forward again. Ida flinched as another knife came sailing towards him and flew over his head. He flinched. Ida tried to stamp down his growing hope as he thought about moving his fingers, and they obeyed him. He could move again. He looked to where Stain and Mastermind were fighting further down the alley, and for one brief moment he considered taking advantage of Stain's distraction and working with Mastermind to bring him down. He shook his head and slowly stood up. No. It had been a stupid decision to come after Stain in the first place. And if the hero killer had taken him down so quickly, what would he do if both Stain and Mastermind decided to kill him? Both had taken down heroes far more experienced than he. He wouldn't stand a chance. He couldn't. He wouldn't do that to his family. Not again. Ida snuck from the alley as quickly as he could before revving up his engines. He had to find Manuel. Is that all you got? Izuku taunted as he stabbed Stain again. I can see why you have killed so many more heroes than you.
You are the worst kind of person on this earth,
Stain growled.
You let other people do your dirty work and then you take all the credit. You take joy in senseless death and violence with no regard for your effect on society.
Oh, I understand my effect on society, all right, Izuku said as he blocked another throwing knife. I understand that they fear me, that they think I'm powerful, that the kid they all thought was weak is stronger than all of the rest of them.
So it's revenge you're after then, is it?
Stain panted as he pulled another knife from his sheath.
You're just as bad as that kid I'll kill later.
Revenge? No, I'm afraid it's far simpler than that, Izuku replied. Society made me who I am. They tossed me aside, and they ignored my pain. They agreed that I was only good for being abused and hated. So guess what? It's my turn to be powerful. Stain rushed at him again with both knives, trying to draw blood from the exposed skin at his face, but Izuku simply bent over and stabbed both of his knives into Stain's gut before backing away.
I'll kill you for what you did to All Might,
Stain choked out. Izuku straightened. The hero killer had lost a lot of blood. He was getting slower and more disoriented the longer the fight wore on. The hero killer was much better at quick battles that allowed him to draw blood early on. He could feel the conviction in Stain's aura, but he barely paid it any mind. He'd felt more murderous intent from Katsuki on a good day. Izuku slowly sauntered forward, and when Stain raised his knife to stab him, he simply knocked the blade out of the way. "Thanks for the fight, Stain," he said. "It's been a nice challenge." "Manuel!" Manuel looked up from the fire he was putting out when he heard his intern's voice. "Ida, where have you been?" He took in the blood staining the white armor, the missing helmet, the tear streaks, and the way his intern was limping. "What happened to you?" The hero killer," Ida choked out, and Manuel felt sick. "I know where he is. He's fighting Mastermind in an alley a few blocks away. I couldn't fight him. He was going to kill me. Native is still there. He's paralyzed with Stain's quirk." "Come on, Lita," Manuel said. "Let's get you to an ambulance." "No!" Ida cried. "You have to catch the hero killer. You have to save Native."
Did you say the hero killer?
Manuel and Ida flinched as Endeavor came up behind him. Ida nodded. "I know where he is."
Lead the way, boy,
Endeavor said, and Ida started running, with Manuel and Endeavor close behind. Shoto Todoroki watched them leave from his place among the sidekicks. Ida looked like he was lucky to have survived. He shook his head and focused on sending ice forward towards some of the fires. Maybe he should have told someone his suspicions about Ida after all. But, he thought, at least that hate in his eyes is gone. "Right down here," Ida called, and then stopped short when he saw the blood. Some of it was his, he knew, but there was a lot more of it than had been on the ground when he left. Endeavor went to Stain, who was lying on the ground, his red scarf bleeding into its surroundings.
Surrender, villain! You cannot escape!
When Stain didn't move, he bent down, keeping one hand on fire just in case. He checked the villain's pulse and swore, extinguishing the light in his hand. Meanwhile, Manuel had gone to help Native. Ida went over to help him, but Manuel just shook his head. "I'm sorry, Ida. It looks like he bled out sometime during the fight." Ida stared at the fallen hero in horror as Manuel put his arm around him and led him out of the alley. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you to a hospital." Chapter 18. Preparations. Shigaraki scowled as he looked at the new recruits. Yeah, Sensei had said it was a good idea to use the hero killer's ideals to grow their numbers, but he just didn't see why. Maybe if Stain's ideals brought in more 6-foot-tall behemoths like Muscular, sure, but a schoolgirl and an emo? This was the League of Villains, not the Disney Channel. "Go away." He glared at them from behind the hand on his face. "I can already tell you're the kind of people I hate the most." "Don't be hasty, Tomura Shigaraki," Kurogiri said. "I'm sure these two will add greatly to our cause."
"Hi, I'm Himiko Toga," the schoolgirl said excitedly. "I loved Mr. Staney. He looked so beat up when he died. It was so cute." She did a little dance in place. "And you worked with Mind-chan, right? He's cute too. I remember when he could barely hold a knife, and he asked me to teach him. It was adorable."
"You taught Mastermind to fight?" the emo asked incredulously. Jiran laughed. "Yeah, I was surprised too, but this cute little lady is the main suspect in a string of exsanguination murders. Mastermind sure does have an eye for quality." Shigaraki glared at the emo. "At least she has the manners to introduce herself. What about you? What's your name?" The emo returned the glare. "Right now I'm going by Dabi." "That's no good. I mean your real name." "You'll know it when you need to know it," Dabi said coldly. "In any case, my new purpose is to carry out the hero killer's will." That wasn't what I asked you, Patchwork! Shigaraki scratched his neck. Why is everyone so hung up on Stain anyway? He's all I ever hear about every goddamn day. It's really pissing me off. He lunged towards the two, who made to fight back, but Kurogiri warped their hands so their attacks went nowhere. Calm yourself, Tomura Shigaraki. If you want to succeed, we must increase our numbers. Our chance is at hand. He leaned close. We must use the hero killer's ideology to further our own ends. Shigaraki stalked away. I'm leaving. He slammed the door behind him. Toga smiled. I really thought he was going to kill us for a sec. I believe he knows what he has to do, Kurogiri said calmly. Shall we get back to you about your recruitment at a later date? Shoto stood awkwardly by the fountain in the mall courtyard. Yaoyorozu had invited him to go with the rest of class, and he hadn't been able to think of a good excuse in time. The rest of the class had split off into groups of 2 and 3, leaving him alone. Yaomomo had invited him to come with her and Jiro to look at swimsuits, but he already had one, so he opted to stay behind. Maybe if he left quickly, no one would question it? Hey, aren't you one of the students from UA? Shoto saw a teenager in a ratty black hoodie, but he couldn't see his face. You were the second-place winner at the sports festival, right? Shoto grimaced as the stranger put an arm around his shoulder. You're pretty powerful. Please get away from me. What can I say? I'm just a huge fan. The man didn't move his arm at all. I can't believe I'm running into you again. It makes me think it might not be a coincidence. Shoto's eyes widened as the man put a hand around his throat, keeping his middle finger lifted. It feels like destiny, but I guess from your perspective, we haven't met since the attack on UA. The man smiled at him, allowing Shoto to see his face. Tomura Shigaraki, the head of the League of Villains with a 5-point disintegration quirk. Shoto swallowed. Suddenly, the hand around his throat felt much more threatening. Why don't we sit down and chat for a while, Shoto Todoroki? Shigaraki led Shoto over to a nearby bench, and they sat down with Shigaraki's hand still at Shoto's throat. I could just freeze you right here, you know, Shoto said, but Shigaraki laughed. If you tried, I'd just put my finger down, and the first thing to go would be your throat. Here, with all these people, a hero would come and catch you. Shigaraki shrugged. Sure, but how many of these smiling sheep can I take down before that happens? I'm fast. I could probably take down 20, 30, maybe even more before a pro finally showed up. These idiots. They assume everyone has their same morals, but any one of them could use their quirk to start a massacre right now. They think laws and rules will protect them. They're convinced nothing bad could ever happen to them. What's your point? Shigaraki shrugged. That's just it. I don't know. I hate pretty much everything, but right now, the hero killer pisses me off the most. Have you ever hated something so much that you just wanted to kill it? My father, Todoroki thought, but he bit his tongue before he could say that. Wasn't the hero killer one of your men? Not technically, Shigaraki replied, but that's what the media made it seem like, and now everyone's obsessed with him. Everything I've done, releasing Nomus on Hosu City, the attack on UA, even killing All Might, it's all been overshadowed by that stupid hero killer and his stupid ideology. In the end, all he did was try to get rid of what he hated, same as me, so why is everyone so obsessed with him? I don't know, Shoto said slowly. Maybe it's because he convinces everyone to hate what he does. His ideology makes sense. Not all heroes deserve the title, and I think maybe everyone knows that deep down. They're just too afraid to say it, or maybe they don't want to believe it. So they just let heroes keep taking their power and abusing the system. Stain was a maniac, but he didn't destroy things just because it sounded fun. He was trying to make a change, show how corrupt the hero system really is. Shoto's voice had dropped to a whisper. That's why I agree with him. Shigaraki looked at him strangely. You have some strange opinions for a hero student. Shoto just stared at the ground desperately. He hadn't really meant to say all that, but maybe it was because Shigaraki was already a villain that Shoto thought maybe the guy would understand. Shigaraki wouldn't judge him for hating heroes because he hated them too. Shoto wondered what had happened to make Shigaraki hate All Might so much. Could it have been something similar to why Todoroki hated Endeavor? So you think people like the hero killer so much because he proved the corruption of hero society? Shoto nodded carefully, and Shigaraki smiled. It all makes sense now. Why All Might pissed me off so much. Why the hero killer made me so angry. It was right in front of me. All Might was the reason why these people smile and think they're safe, because heroes will always protect them. They trust them when, really, heroes don't save everyone, and they don't deserve our trust. Shigaraki released Shoto's throat and looked at him. I don't need to change my ways after all. I just need to prove how fragile society's sense of safety really is. Thank you, Todoroki. You've been a big help. He stood. Don't try to follow me, hero. If you try, I'll get angry. Shoto watched him leave until he disappeared in the crowd. I'm not a hero, he muttered. Toga hugged Izuku the moment he walked into the bar and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Mine-chan, how are you? It's been so long. Izuku laughed and pried her hands away. Himiko, you just saw me a few weeks ago. It feels like an eternity, she pouted. Welcome, Mastermind, Kurogiri said. Can I get you a drink? Sure, I'll take cranberry juice if you have any. Kurogiri nodded, and a laugh came from the corner. You have no qualms about murdering heroes, and yet you're worried about the legal drinking age? Dabi scoffed. Some villain. Izuku raised an eyebrow. It's not so much that I'm concerned about the legal drinking age as it is that I make my living with my brain, and I prefer not to have anything slowing it down. He turned back to the bar. You're Dabi, right? Cremation quirk? Yeah, Dabi said, and took the seat next to Izuku at the bar. How did you know? I make it my business to know everyone in the underground, especially if I'm going to be working with them. Izuku said simply. I've had my eye on you for a while now. Dabi looked vaguely concerned, but it was hard to tell many facial expressions with his scars. Kurogiri set a glass of cranberry juice down at the bar, and Izuku pulled down his mask, letting it pool around his neck. Whoa, Mastermind, Dabi said. Aren't you concerned about people seeing your face? Izuku smiled. I'm concerned about heroes seeing my face. As odd as it sounds, my identity's not completely unknown in the underground. Jiran and Himiko know who I am, for example, and quite a few people have seen my face. Dabi raised an eyebrow. And you're not concerned about anyone snitching to the cops? Izuku shook his head. I was at first, but normally by the time people know my face, they're familiar with my reputation. He took a sip of his juice. I've got a bit of a temper. If anyone screws me over, I'll screw them over twice as hard. There was a gang a few months back. The Blue Dogs, have you heard of them? Dabi nodded. They're dead now, aren't they? Izuku nodded gleefully. They tried to threaten me into working with them rather than paying me. Oh, I gave them their plans. Then I tracked them down, and I tracked down all their enemies, and made sure they knew the weakness of every single one. They didn't last a week. Dabi shivered. Remind me not to piss you off. Izuku smiled. If I have to remind you, it's already too late. Shigaraki walked into the room. Thanks for coming, Mastermind. It's always more fun when you're my player, too. Not a problem, Shigaraki. You pay well, and your jobs are always interesting. So what do you have in mind? Shigaraki sat at the bar. We are going to show society how fragile safety is by attacking the UA training camp, kidnapping one of the students, and turning them to villainy. Izuku thought for a moment. That might be difficult. Do you have a plant in place? Shigaraki shook his head. We have a spy, but not one I'm willing to pull out yet. He'll be leaking the location to us as soon as they arrive. Izuku nodded. All right, then. Who do you have in mind? Shigaraki smiled, and he pulled a photo from his pocket. Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku frowned and took the photo. It was of Katsuki chained up on the podium at the sports festival. He'd taken offense that Todoroki hadn't used his fire in their fight, so his win didn't mean anything. Izuku got where he was coming from, but at the same time, Todoroki didn't use his fire against anyone, so Katsuki really shouldn't have taken it personally. Yeah, no, that's a terrible idea. Dabi laughed as Shigaraki stared at Izuku in shock. But he already acts villainous. I know. Izuku laughed. The problem is he's too stubborn. You'll never be able to get Katsuki to be a villain because he doesn't see himself as one. He sees himself as a hero, and no amount of threatening or bribery is going to change him. He let the group digest that information before continuing. If you're really serious about recruiting a hero student, I'd suggest going after Shoto Todoroki instead. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Dabi tense, and he smiled. The #1 hero's son, Shigaraki said in confusion. What makes you think we'll be able to turn him? Take it from someone who used to want to be a hero. Izuku smiled as the group reacted to that. People don't turn to villainy without a reason, and Todoroki has one of the best reasons I've ever seen. He was abused by a hero for years, and no one saved him. Who would ever believe that the #1 hero was guilty of child abuse? Izuku lifted his glass to take a drink. And besides, we have his brother to help us convince him. The others looked confused as Dabi stared at him in shock. How did you know? Strong fire quirk, bright teal eyes, a hatred of all heroes, but especially Endeavor. Izuku shrugged. It wasn't that hard to put together. I told you, I've had my eye on you for a while. He looked at Dabi in the eyes. So, what do you say, Toya Todoroki? Are you ready to see your brother? Chapter 19. Training Camp. The UA trader rolled his eyes at his classmates' antics as the bus rolled to a stop. He quickly sent a text sharing his location with Shigaraki. This would show those Class A assholes. Why did Shoto have to be paired with Bakugo of all people for the test of courage? It wasn't that he hated him, it's just that Bakugo was just so loud. They were almost at a halfway point when they saw smoke in the distance. Hey, Icy Hot, I thought you never used your fire. I don't, Shoto said. I didn't like that. Well then who did? Because we're the only ones here with fire quirks, and it sure as hell wasn't me. Shoto looked around as he prepared to use his ice. Be quiet. Don't tell me what to do, Icy Hot. Be quiet. There might be villains. Bakugo scowled. If this is some sort of trick by those Class B losers. Shoto rolled his eyes. At least he wasn't yelling anymore. Both boys crinkled their noses as a smell like rotten eggs started wafting through the forest, along with the pink mist. What the? Shoto put his hand over his nose as he began to feel lightheaded. The smoke is poisonous. We have to get out of here. No shit, Sherlock, Bakugo growled, keeping his own mouth and nose plugged. As they ran away from the smoke, coming across a Class B student who had passed out on the trail, Shoto hesitated a moment before putting the boy on his back. Heroes never saved him, but maybe he could save his classmates. They continued on, slower than before due to the extra weight. Because he was no longer covering his face, Shoto got lightheaded much quicker than what he had before, and it was only the practice he had working through the pain of his father's training that kept him going. That was probably why it took him longer than it should have to see the black figure kneeling on the path in front of him. Who's that? Bakugo asked, and then he noticed his severed hand. Which group was in front of us again? Tokoyami, I think, Shoto replied softly, trying not to think that the hand might be one of theirs. And Shoji. So pretty, the figure whispered. No, have to work. But it's so delicious, beautiful flesh. The man turned around, revealing a wide mouth held open with hooks. Despite the fact that the man's eyes were covered, Shoto could feel him looking straight at him. I have a job to do. Aizawa watched in horror as his capture weapon went through the villain. As the flame villain melted into goo, he smirked. I wonder if you can save your students. Mr. Aizawa, help! Eraser looked to see Ida running out of the woods as fast as he could, panic on his face. Show me your blood! A giant villain barreled after him, muscle fibers bulging. Aizawa's eyes widened as he recognized Muscular, and he activated his quirk. What did you do? Muscular screamed as he deflated, but Aizawa quickly wrapped him in his capture weapon and kneed the villain in the face, knocking him out before blinking. He took in the sight of Muscular's blood-coated fists before turning back to Ida. Are you all right? Ida nodded. The rest of our classmates should be along shortly. I told them to hide because I was the only one able to outrun the villain. Aizawa nodded.
Good work. Head inside. Vlad King is already waiting for you with the other students. I'll be back.
He didn't look to see if Ida obeyed as he ran into the woods. If he'd heard the flame villain correctly, his students were the targets. He had to save them, or at least get to Mandalay to give them permission to fight back. His heart gripped in panic. It was like the USJ all over again. Only this time, the villains wouldn't let the students live because they'd already got what they wanted. The students were what they wanted, which was infinitely worse. The only students he passed on his way when he ran were Jiro, Mineta, and Koda, who promised to go straight to camp. It wasn't long before he reached the clearing where the test of courage was supposed to begin. A lizard-looking villain with a sword made out of other swords was bearing down on Mandalay, and Aizawa managed to pull her head out of the way with his capture weapon just in time to prevent her from being cut into ribbons.
Mandalay, are you all right?
Eraser, have you seen Koda? Aizawa felt his stomach sink.
No, I haven't, but I need you to send a message to all the students. Tell them to use their quirks in training, that I'm authorizing to engage in combat with the villains.
Mandalay looked shocked. Are you sure? Aizawa nodded.
I'll take the heat. Our students are the targets. They need to be able to defend themselves.
Ah! A large woman in sunglasses said as she ran at them. Who squealed? Wait! The lizard villain cried. That's Eraserhead. He's an underground hero, and if Stain were alive, he'd likely judge him as a true hero. Aizawa wasn't quite sure how he felt about that, but the most important part was that the villains were too busy arguing to attack. So what? So we must be sure we're abiding by Stain's principle. The lizard villain was cut off by a kick to the head from Mandalay. At the same time, the other villain was knocked out by Tiger. Thank you for the help, Eraserhead, Tiger said as Mandalay sent a message to the students. Things were getting kind of rough out there. Where are Pixie Bob and Ragdoll? Tiger looked behind him, and Aizawa paled as he saw Pixie Bob lying on the ground. Ragdoll hasn't checked in yet. Aizawa took a deep breath. He couldn't worry about that right now.
Get her back to camp. I need to go look for the rest of the students.
Tiger nodded as Aizawa ran farther into the woods. Shoto put up another ice wall to stop the blades, careful to avoid the Class B boy he laid on the ground. Don't just run into this fight, Bakugo. Whatever, Icy Hot. We've been given permission to fight, so that's what I'm gonna do. Shoto swore as Moonfish dodged his ice wall again and took off into the trees. This guy's quirk is way too good at navigating this terrain. This freak looks like a scrawny little sidekick to me. He shifted into a battle stance. Come at me, you bastard! You can't use your explosions, Bakugo. You could start a forest fire and kill our classmates. Whatever, Icy Hot. I'm not an idiot. Todoroki doubted that. Right now, Bakugo was acting just like Endeavor. Take down the villain, show his own strength, don't care who gets hurt in the process. He looked behind him, where the wall of poisoned glass was now clearly visible. Between Moonfish and the gas, they didn't have anywhere to run. Bakugo ran at Moonfish with an explosion, breaking some of the blade teeth and causing the villain to cry out in pain. Bakugo smirked. Watch out! Shoto cried as Moonfish's blade teeth flashed, but Bakugo couldn't move out of the way in time. He grit his teeth in pain as he was stabbed through the shoulder. You fucker! He yelled. I'll kill you! Shoto knew he should send an ice wall to protect his classmate, but he could already feel the hypothermia setting in. That, combined with the gas, was making it almost impossible to think straight. Flesh, blood, sweet. Moonfish stabbed Bakugo again. This time he got close enough for the student to grab his face. Die! Bakugo screamed and let off the full force of explosion in Moonfish's face. Shoto idly wondered if it was bigger than the one he'd used during his fight with Uraraka at the sports festival. When the smoke cleared, several trees were smoking, and the villain was heavily singed and unconscious. Weak-ass villain! Bakugo spit a dollop of blood onto the ground before looking at Shoto, who just barely had enough time to wonder about the look of alarm on his face before he felt himself collapse like a telescope. By the time the nauseating sensation has ended, he was surrounded by blue glass walls, and neither Bakugo nor the forest was anywhere to be seen. Uraraka and Sue shifted into battle stances as they stared down the villain in front of them. What kind of person slashes someone out of nowhere? Sue said. Who do you think you are? The girl pointed at them with a bloody knife. I'm Toga. You two are super cute, Uraraka and Asui. She must know us from the sports festival, Uraraka said. But we don't know anything about her, so we're at a disadvantage, Sue replied. There's not enough blood, Toga pouted. Normally I'd suck it straight out of the cut to get it flowing, but there's no time. Don't worry, girls. My fun new toy will start pumping as soon as I stick it in you. I'll get my fill in no time. She looked at them from beneath her lashes. Who's first? Sue threw Uraraka in the air with her tongue the moment Toga started running. You have to get back to camp. We have permission to defend ourselves, not counterattack. Ah! Sue cried out as Toga slashed her tongue. Sue! Uraraka yelled. Toga stopped for a moment. Sue, that's so cute. I think I'll call you that too. Sue backed away in fear. Only my friends can call me that. Toga laughed as she pinned Sue against a tree with a needle. I guess that means we're friends now. Oh, you're so cute when you bleed. Get away from her! Uraraka yelled. Toga turned and came at her with a knife, but Uraraka used her gunhead martial arts and pinned her to the ground. That was amazing, Ochako. Ochako, you're cute too. Toga stabbed her in the leg and let her machine pull the blood out. Uraraka! Aizawa called out their name as they ran into the clearing and activated his quirk. Aizawa-sensei, you have to help her, Sue cried. Toga jumped away from Uraraka and ran off into the forest. I don't feel like being killed tonight, she giggled. Toodles! Uraraka. Aizawa knelt beside her on the ground. You're hurt. She shook her head. It's not bad. Good. He nodded and then stood. Make your way back to camp. I've cleared the forest between here and there, so you should be fine if you hurry. Uraraka nodded, and the girls were about to leave when they heard a rustling in the trees. All three tensed and prepared to fight, but instead of a villain, it was Bakugo who went through the clearing. He was carrying another student on his back, and he looked halfway between exploding and crying. Bakugo, Aizawa said. You were paired with Todoroki for the exercise. Where is he? Bakugo shook his head. They took him. Those damn bastards stole Icy Hot. Aizawa's stomach dropped. This was bad. In terms of worst possible case scenarios, a kidnapped student was pretty high on the list. Did you see where they took him? Bakugo just shook his head again. It was some asshole in a yellow coat. He collapsed Icy Hot into a fucking marble and ran off through the treetops. I tried to follow them, but... He grimaced. I overused my quirk fighting, and the one who was trying to kill us. And the bastard was too fast for me to follow on foot. All of a sudden, he screamed as he kicked out at the base of a tree. I just feel so fucking helpless! Aizawa put his hand on his shoulder.
Bakugo, you and the girls get the student back to safety. There's not much you can do out here anyways if you're suffering from quirk exhaustion. I'll find Todoroki.
Bakugo looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just scoffed.
Fine. They were headed east when I lost track of them.
Aizawa nodded and ran east. It was a long shot, but if there was any possibility Todoroki was still there, he had to try and save them.
Now we just have to wait for the others to regroup here. This place was supposed to be hard to find because of the wall of flames and poisoning gas.
Dabi sighed.
But it looks like the gas is gone.
Aizawa hid in the trees, following the flame villain from earlier and a guy named Twice who kept arguing with himself. At one point, he'd seen Aoyama cowering behind some bushes, but Aizawa just put a finger to his lips and gestured for him to leave. Aizawa wanted nothing more than to take both the villains down right now, but he held himself back. Bakugo said that the one who stole Todoroki had a yellow coat, and the forest was large enough that Aizawa would never be able to find him on his own. His only hope was to follow Dabi and Twice to the meetup point and retake Todoroki from the villain who had him. Dabi and Twice stopped walking as Toga emerged from the trees.
Hey, crazy! Did you get the blood? How many kids?
1 person.
Just 1? Twice whined. Good job! Weren't you supposed to get 3?
That's just the way it went down. I thought those brats were going to kill me if that pro showed up.
Whatever, it's fine, Twice said. Shouldn't you be full of shame?
Both of you, shut up, Dabi ordered. You're too loud.
Welcome, Mr. Compress. Did you get the kid?
Aizawa moved the moment a yellow-coated figure jumped down from the trees, tripping him with the capture weapon and activating his quirk. A ripping sound filled the clearing as Mr. Compress's coat was in tatters, and Todoroki was kneeling on the ground, looking disoriented.
Todoroki!
Aizawa ran towards him and saw his eyes widen before a massive wall of blue flame blocked his field of vision.
It's been 5 minutes since the signal, the voice declared. Let's go.
Aizawa activated his quirk and tried to see anyone, but the flames were too bright, and Dabi made sure to stay hidden behind them so Aizawa couldn't see him. When the flames finally disappeared, Aizawa readied his capture weapon for a fight and looked around for the villains, but all he saw was an empty forest. Chapter 20. To be a hero. Shoto woke up, hazed and disoriented. By the time he was aware enough to look around the room, he'd been tied to a chair with Kirk-suppressant cuffs. A man with painful-looking scars sat in a chair across the room from him, but from what Shoto could see, they were the only two in the room.
Hey, Shoto, the man said softly. It's good to see you.
Shoto frowned slightly. He didn't understand why a villain, even one who just kidnapped him, was happy to see him. Who are you?
The man smiled slightly. I go by Dabi, but I think you can guess that's not my real name.
He leaned forward.
We knew each other once, before I got these scars.
And I'm just supposed to know who you are? Dabi shrugged.
Oh, it's not like you knew a whole lot of people back then. Flaming bastard kept you isolated so no one could distract you from your training.
That made Shoto pause. He'd never heard anyone talk about Endeavor that way, with the same intense hatred he himself felt. Against his better judgment, he found himself actually liking the villain that had kidnapped him. But how did he know about Shoto's isolation?
My hair was red then, too, kind of like yours.
Dabi continued, producing a brilliant blue flame and watching it flicker with brilliant teal eyes. Shoto racked his brain, trying to think of who this guy could be. Red hair, like his left side. Strong flame quirk, like his left side. Teal eyes, like... Shoto's eyes widened. Toya? The man smiled.
Hey there, little brother.
Aizawa rested his head in his hands as he sat in the interrogation room, waiting for Sakachi. Dozens of students hurt by gas or by the other villains, another in critical condition from a classmate's rampaging quirk, an abducted pro hero, a kidnapped student.
and a dead child. The 3 measly villains they'd managed to capture were nothing in comparison to the unmitigated horror that the training camp had been. Aizawa looked up when he heard the door open. Tsukachi looked at him sympathetically and set a cup of coffee down in front of him. "How are you holding up?" "I couldn't save him," Aizawa said. "I knew they'd taken him, and I got so close, but at the last minute I was too weak." He looked at the detective. "What kind of teacher lets his own student be kidnapped?" Tsukachi sighed. "We're dealing with elite villains, the like of which we haven't seen since before All Might's debut. The blame for this incident is theirs and theirs alone. This was the same group that managed to kill the symbol of peace, so don't blame yourself that you couldn't take them all out. That being said, we do need your statement of the incident. Maybe it can help us find Todoroki in time."
"Do you know why he was taken?"
Aizawa asked. Tsukachi shook his head.
"We were hoping that you knew."
"The best we can come up with is that he was probably abducted to use as leverage against Endeavor. These villains are targeting Hero Society itself, so it'd be in line with their goals." Aizawa nodded. "The first I knew of the attack was when Mandalay sent out the message. I left Flag King and the other students and left to go fight. As soon as I left the main building, I was confronted by a flame user who implied that they were after the students. I tried to interrogate him, but he dissolved into goo before I could get any more information out of him." "Goo?" Tsukachi questioned. "I thought you said he had a fire quirk."
"He did,"
Aizawa sighed.
"I think the goo was some kind of cloning quirk belonging to another villain."
Tsukachi nodded. "What happened next?"
"I took out Muscular as he tried to chase one of the students. I then went into the forest, sending any students I came across back to camp. I had just saved Uraraka and Asui when Bakugo found me and told me that Todoroki had been kidnapped by a villain in a yellow coat that had compressed him into a marble. I searched and found the flame villain I'd fought earlier talking to someone else. I followed them until I saw the villain that had taken Todoroki, and then cancelled this quirk, which temporarily freed Todoroki." He grit his teeth. "And then everything went to shit. The fire quirk user used his flames to block my field of vision. I couldn't see him to cancel his quirk, and I couldn't see any of the other villains either. By the time the flames had disappeared, they were gone, taking Todoroki with them." "What did the villains look like? Can you give me any physical characteristics?" Aizawa nodded. "Let's start with the fire user. What did he look like?" Tall, black hair, teal eyes. His skin was pale, but his neck and his arms, as well as part of his face, were covered in large burn scars that appeared to be stitched together with his normal skin."
Tsukachi paused in his note-taking. "You said he was held together by stitches." As soon as Aizawa said yes, Tsukachi stood and opened the door. "Sansa, bring me the report on the canvassing operation."
"What's wrong?"
"Nothing," Tsukachi smiled, "but we might have a location on the League of Villains." "Father told us you died." Dabi scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Yeah, because after all the shit that guy's done, he'll definitely draw the line at lying." Shoto frowned. It made sense. A little too much sense, actually, but he still wasn't sure that Dabi was telling the truth. "If you're really my brother," he said suspiciously, "what would we do on weekends when Endeavor was out with the Hiroka mission?" Dabi's eyes lit up. "Mom would gather us all in the front room with all the pillows and blankets in the house, and she and Fuyumi would make us hot chocolate, and we'd watch a movie. Then we'd make a game of cleaning up so there was no trace of what happened by the time Father came home." He frowned. "We stopped that tradition when Endeavor locked Mom away." Shoto stared. None of them had ever told anyone about that tradition, so Endeavor would never find out. There was no way he could have known about it, much less spoke about it with such happiness, unless he really was Toya. "I also remember that Mom would ice your bruises and burns after Endeavor's training," he spit out bitterly. "After she was gone, Fuyumi took over that job." Dabi met Shoto's eyes. They did the same thing for me when I was subjected to that bastard training before you got your quirk.
You went through it too, Shoto breathed out, and Dabi nodded.
It was hell. He'd make me work past my body's limits, producing fire for hours even though it hurt. He'd kick me when I was down and then blame me for being weak when I couldn't stand up again. He'd constantly remind me that I wasn't good enough, even though I was the best shot he had at defeating All Might at the time. He scowled. And when you finally got your quirk, he tossed me aside as just another failure, forgetting all the abuse he'd put me through, nor favor of abusing you.
I'm sorry, Shoto said. I'm sorry he forgot about you.
Dabi shrugged. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry you got the perfect quirk and had to go through that hell disguised as training longer than I ever did. He chuckled. Even back when I was living at home, I'd fantasize about what I'd do to the bastard if I ever got a chance, how I'd kill him when I got strong enough. Even as he was pounding me into the floor, I hated him even then. He looked at Shoto. You hate him too, don't you? Shoto swallowed, but he nodded, absently. He knew that, as Endeavor's masterpiece, he shouldn't be bonding with the villain, but Dabi was his brother who understood. His brother who had the same burning hatred for their father as he did. Even Natsuo and Fuyumi couldn't understand. Not in the same way. That's why you don't use your fire, isn't it? Dabi asked. Because you hate him. Shoto nodded. It's his quirk. I don't need his power, just like I don't need him. But Dabi shook his head. There's a better option here. Shoto tilted his head in silent question, and Dabi continued. Endeavor gave you that fire so you'd become a hero. So, what if you were to use that fire for something that dear old Dad would hate? Shoto started, remembering his Midoriya's words in the sports festival. You could always use it to do things your father would hate. How would you like to use your fire to show him just how wrong he was? How would you like to use it to show him just how much you hate him? Shoto thought for a minute. He was supposed to be a hero, that was what he'd been raised to do, but the idea of showing his father just how much he'd hurt him was tempting. His father was the one that was always pushing Shoto to become a hero, but had he ever really wanted that? Maybe he had once, back when he was a little kid, back before his mother had been forced away from him, but that small desire had been burned and kicked out of Shoto by a decade of abuse. The only reason he was even at UA was because it was what his father wanted. But what did Shoto want? He clenched his fists as the hate burning in his heart grew even hotter. He wanted to show the world what kind of person Endeavor really was, and hurt him like he'd hurt Shoto. He wanted to hurt everyone who thought that heroes were perfect and would always save the day. He wanted to prove to them that heroes weren't gods. He wanted to hurt all the heroes who must have known something was going on, but never once came to save him. He looked at his brother with fire in his eyes. So, Shoto, Dabi asked, how would you like to be a villain?